So the subtitle of this conference is Mathematics, Logic, and Philosophy. And so I think it's in order to focus on logic and philosophy too, and more specifically on the knock-on effect of Grothendieck's mathematical work on philosophy. And I think that that knock-on effect is still to work out and to evaluate. And one thing stands in the way of our realizing that effect and making it more real. And I think it's the divide between ideal language philosophy and ordinary language philosophy in particular, and also a certain organization of philosophy itself. Anyway, I would like to speak of context dependence because it's a central topic within philosophy, at least philosophy of language. And I think it's an important illustration of the point I've just mentioned, namely that the work of Grothendieck is still to be implemented within philosophy. And context dependence is a central topic to consider because it concentrates the debate I've just mentioned between ideal language philosophy and ordinary language philosophy. So more generally, I think that the birth of analytic philosophy relies on the pact between philosophy and mathematics. Mathematics helps philosophy to represent language and thought, while philosophy brings out the unity and conceptuality of mathematics. And I think that this pact cannot be jettisoned without analytic philosophy having to explain what remains its rationale. So if we think of the founding fathers, Frege and Russell, the functional language of mathematics has provided philosophy with a powerful tool to understand concepts or propositional functions. And that functional scheme has been extrapolated in various ways about modalities and about context dependence. Let's think of Carnot, Montague, Kaplan. And I think that that functional scheme is simply not adequate to handle context dependence. That's something I would like to explain. So one word.
Explain why?
Yes, I will explain why. Yes. Just to begin with, I would like to explain what context dependence is. So it covers all the cases. It's something very simple, very basic, and so something philosophically central. It covers all the cases where the semantic content of an utterance depends on the context of utterance. So you have basic examples, the indexicals. The reference of I depends on the identity of the person who is speaking. But you have more complicated examples. So it's raining. Here and now is implicit. I had breakfast. Implicit. The implicit content is that refers to this morning, and so on. You can see that depending on the context, John is tall will be true or false. It will be true if the standard is a sixth grader, and it will be false if the standard is a basketball player. So you can see that the content and even the true value of an utterance depends on the context. It's something basic. Okay. But the dependence is not basic. I mean, it's something highly complicated, subtle, and that's something I would like to pursue. I think that the general philosophical problem raised by context dependence pertains to the status of meaning. When I utter the word bread or the sentence, there is still milk in the refrigerator, I can mean a lot of different things depending on the context. And they do not share a common core. So meaning is not some kind of invariant that could be obtained by abstraction. But at the same time, meaning lies fully in each of its instances without being reducible to what they all have in common. So in each contextual case, you have a modulation of the meaning of an expression, which amounts to a real enrichment, which meaning itself cannot be at the source of, and yet that modulation can be considered afterward as part of that meaning. So how to explain these dynamics of meaning? There are two main approaches. You can think of meaning as a function or meaning as a family of semblance to try to explain, pinpoint what is the status of meaning with respect to all its contextual instances. I think that context dependence proved the first approach to be a failure. This is the failure of Secantism. I will explain what it is, and I will explain why I think it's a failure. And the second approach, considering meaning as a family resemblance, relies on a mere metaphor and is essentially descriptive. And for that reason, I think that the philosophical problem of meaning and context dependence calls for a third approach. And my purpose here is simply to show how Grothendieck helps to pave the way for such a third approach. So I have to give you a bird's eye view of the philosophical debates about context dependence. It's the first thing to note is that context dependence is so complex that it seems to defeat any attempt to present it in a formal way. And that's why context dependence has elicited three main philosophical stances that I will call the three views. That's how they are presented in the literature. So you can think that context dependence is supposed to elude any formal representation, that the view of contextualism, which stands in the which stands with ordinary language philosophy, basically, or you can think that context dependence has to be modeled on the case of indexicals, and then the case of indexicals is generalized to all other cases of context dependence. That's the indexicalist view, or you can be a minimalist or a literalist and consider that context dependence is but a pragmatic phenomenon which does not concern the semanticist. So you have very simple cases of context dependence with indexicals, but apart from those cases, context dependence is not our business. That's the view, typical view of minimalism. So just to complete the picture about context dependence, you have to distinguish three components about any utterance. The linguistic meaning, what is literally said, what is uttered, that's the first component. What is said, the semantic content of the utterance, that's the content of or what is said. And third component, the informational value that is conveyed by an utterance. And conflating the second component with the first one is the hallmark of minimalism. So the semantic content is just what has been literally said, uttered. Sorry, not said, uttered. And integrating what is conveyed into the semantic content is the hallmark of contextualism. So to give you an example, if I say Mary took out the key and opened the door, you understand that Mary opened the door with the key. From the point of view of minimalism, it's just an inference that is not part of the semantic content. Whereas for contextualism, the fact that Mary took out the key and opened the door with that key is an integral part of the semantic content of what has been said. So that's an example to understand the different approaches and the difference in the contextualist analysis and the minimalist one. Okay, so now there's a third view to describe, namely indexicalism. It's the conception of context dependence, according to which any contextual effect has to be traced back to a semantic index, which is provided by the context. And the task of the semanticist in the indexicalist view is to delineate a free variable position in the semantic structure of each expression to account for the specific content that a certain utterance has in a certain context. So there are hidden parameters whose value is provided by the context. And so you have to bring out those parameters. So if I say John is tall, actually the real analysis of that sentence should add a parameter, comparison class parameter. And depending on the context, the parameter will get a different value. So in that view, context dependence can always be traced back to an actual semantic constituent provided by the context in the form of a parameter. And that's, I think, the strongest way of maintaining the functional scheme, and maybe the strongest way of maintaining an ideal ideal language philosophy. The problem with that indexicalist view is that contextual parameters can be multiplied indefinitely as more and more contexts are taken in. So I will just give you an example.
Why is it a problem?
So if I say there's milk in the refrigerator, as uttered to someone looking at his cup of black coffee versus to someone who was given the task of cleaning the refrigerator, clearly the content is not the same in both cases. So to account for that difference, the indexicalist is bound to introducing a parameter. And so the analysis would be there F is G milk in the refrigerator, where F is a parameter which specifies the existence of milk as available for someone or as simply existing, and where G specifies the subsistence of milk in the refrigerator or as spilled or as contained in a bottle. And it's not difficult to see that indefinitely many parameters can be introduced in that way, which contradicts the fact that a sentence has a finite complexity. And so the only way out for the indexicalist is either to maintain that all context dependence is syntactically triggered, or to accept that each context all at once creates the slots and provides the semantic values that are filled within them. In the first case, indexicalism veers towards minimalism. In the second case, it drifts into contextualism. And so indexicalism is a very unstable philosophical position. So I think that context dependence crystallizes where the relationship between philosophy, logic, and mathematics now stands, at least within philosophy of language. In the contextualist view, context dependence lacks any formal representation because it cannot have one. Okay, we have to abandon that ideal language philosophy and study ordinary language as it is without claiming that we can give a formal representation of it. In the minimalist view, context dependence does not need to have a formal representation because it's a very restricted phenomenon as a semantic one. And in the indexicalist view, context dependence must have a formal representation based on functions taken literally. I think that all three views share the result of the same mathematical toolkit set in stone, and along which a formal representation of context dependence should proceed if it were to proceed at all. So given that toolkit, maybe it's possible certain philosophers will think that it's possible to give context dependence of formal representation. Other philosophers will consider that it is doomed. But the shared presupposition is that the tools to achieve that formal representation are the ones that we know and that have been set in stone since Tarski, basically. And I think that this technical consensus between philosophers is based also on a philosophical consensus, namely the functionality assumption, according to which the semantic content of a context-dependent expression is the value of the function that the linguistic meaning of the expression is. And I think that all three views share that assumption, were it to defend it or to attack it. Indexicalism endorses the functionality assumption and taking it literally, whereas contextualism and minimalism oppose it. But all three views maintain the following prior assumption, which I call the context unit assumption, namely that every contextual content refers to only one context at a time. So here the common logical, technical, philosophical platform of the three views. Context dependence works one context at a time. Either it can be represented as a functional dependence, which means that meaning is a function whose argument is the context of utterance, or it can not be represented at all. And that platform is partly an artifact of due to the mathematical toolkit set in stone by all those views, by all the representatives of the three views. And once locked into thinking about context dependence and about language in general, within that straitjacket, one is doomed to endorse a false alternative between idle language philosophy and ordinary language philosophy. Okay. So context dependence certainly implies some kind of functionality. But my hypothesis, what I would like to contend is that that functionality is not correctly represented by a function in the usual sense. So now if you consider indexicalism, we have reasons to do so because indexicalism is the most advanced attempt to formalize context dependence. Okay. And we've just seen why it is hindered by a real problem. The fact that, I mean, namely the inflation of contextual parameters that you have to bring in. And I think that that failure of indexicalism is linked to the illusion that the context-dependent semantic content can be reconstructed from scratch as an ideal function of unmanageably many contextual parameters. In contrast, I think that the only way to go is to understand context dependence as a relative thing, which means that each context-dependent semantic content, not context content, should be understood as the update prompted by a manageable context shift of some prior content. So we don't know what a context is, and we don't know how to analyze a contextual semantic content, but we know more how it changes and how to represent the variation of a context or the variation of a semantic content. And I think it's a classical structuralist move in the sense of Claude Lévi-Strauss, for example. Lévi-Strauss says, when you're facing a very complicated, highly complicated phenomenon, like a human society or a human face, don't try to describe it, but try instead to describe how those things relate to each other. And that structuralist move is supported by a strong cognitive basis that I won't delve into, but there are many studies about that. So my proposal is to conceive of the contextual content of any context-dependent expression as resulting from the transposition of the content of that expression in some prior context of reference, along the context shift through which the current context of utterance relates to that context of reference. So, to give you an example, of course, for lack of time, I will proceed from giving you all the details, and I will have to confine myself to very basic examples. But I hope it will be sufficient. So, in a context of passive observation, the word red depicts an object whose external surface is mostly red. For instance, a red bird. Okay. But in the context of active production, the same word depicts an object capable of eliciting a red surface. For instance, a red pen, which can be black, but which writes red. Okay. So the content of red, as it is used in the second context, pen, derives from the content that it has okay.
Okay, thank you. I agree with what you say. You have to be more convincing.
Monsieur, bonsoir. Sur le territoire,
Okay. So your first context where red is applied to a bird, and the second context where it is applied to a pen, and the content of red as it is used in the second context derives from the content that it has in the first context through the transposition induced by the context shift, turning an observational intent into a productional one. So to summarize, my proposal is to understand context dependence as a context shift dependence, where the semantic contents of a context dependent expression results from the transposition induced by some context shift, as in the example I've just given. There's a second motivation of my proposal, which is that we have to account for the connection between the linguistic meaning of an expression and its semantic content in various contexts. And if the former is heterogeneous with the latter, how to understand the connection between the linguistic meaning and the semantic contents. So given that heterogeneity, contextualism basically sacrifices linguistic meaning on the altar of contextual contents, meaning being a mere useless fiction. Whereas minimalism, on the contrary, sacrifices the content on the altar of the meaning, and the semantic content becomes a mere pragmatic coating, as opposed to what matters, which is the linguistic meaning. I think the only way out to understand the connection between linguistic meaning and contextual contents is to conceive of the linguistic meaning itself as being some kind of contextual content, namely the content of an expression in a certain context of reference, which is by default the generic context of use of that expression as the context of its definition in the dictionary, if you want. I will be more specific in a moment. So the contextual instantiation of linguistic meaning has to be conceived of as a transposition of semantic content from a context of reference to the current context of utterance. The linguistic meaning being a semantic content in its own right, attached to a special context namely the generic context of use of the expression. And that way of describing things has a great advantage, namely it allows one to overcome the gap between the linguistic meaning of an utterance and its contextual contents. Okay. Just to get back one last time to the three views, contextualism takes content to result from a holistic intra-contextual process which eludes any analysis, any formal analysis, any lexical tracking. Indexicalism and minimalism trace semantic content to a context-independent move, either a trans-contextual function in the indexicalist view or an extra-contextual meaning in the minimalist view. My proposal aims to strike a balance between too little or too much rule, and to account for the fact that the semantic content of an expression in a certain context is neither created nor simply actualized by the current context, but transposed according to rules which do not preclude some genuine novelty. The other question is about meaning. Where does meaning come from? So difficult to find an answer in the literature. Our answer, my answer anyway, is that the meaning of an expression is its semantic content in its generic context of use. But of course, I now must be a little more specific about that idea. So the idea is to understand meaning, the linguistic meaning of an expression as built up from the semantic contents that expression takes on in a sample of its context of use, according to an amalgamation process showing how those contents add up in a common genericization of their respective context, given that they overlap consistently when considered in a common refinement of their respective contexts. So the linguistic meaning of an expression is the result of an amalgamation process about the semantic contents that expression has in a sample of paradigmatic uses of it. And of course, looking at the meaning of an expression as the result of an amalgamation process is possible because the linguistic meaning is conceived of as a semantic content in the first place. So my proposal relies on two connected analyses. First, the analysis of context dependence as context shift dependence, and the analysis of linguistic meaning as the result of an amalgamation of semantic contents, which presupposes that meaning is itself a semantic content. So I just phrased things as I've done to suggest the mathematical background that I have in mind. So I'm giving the game away, but I think it will be clearer that way. My working hypothesis is that the mathematical counterpart of what I just described is the framework of descent theory within the fiber category. So context shift corresponds to base change, transposition to what's called a reindexing function. I will explain all of those terms. Semantic contents correspond to local data. The linguistic meaning of an expression corresponds to the global item that can be reconstructed from local data. And the amalgamation process I've just spoken of corresponds to what is called the descent datum in descent theory. So I will now explain all those technical terms and that background of descent theory. So a fiber category is a functor with a special lifting property. So any object of F is said to lie above an object of C if its image is the object X of C. And similarly for a morphism of the category F. And the category of all the objects and morphisms which lie above X is called the fiber above X. And the category C of the fiber category is called the base category. So now the lifting property that defines the fiber category is that any morphism in the base category has a kind of universal lifting in the upper category F. Okay, here is the exact definition in the picture. I will have to be quick because I want to give you the details, but I will have to be quick. So here is the lifting property. For each morphism U in the base category C, you're ensured to have a morphism Q has in the category F, which is the lifting of U, basically. And if you specify a Cartesian lift for each morphism of the base category, you define what is called a cleavage of the fiber category. And writing the Cartesian lift in that way, so writing U star of E for the domain of the Cartesian lift, you introduce a functor U star from the fiber above the codomain of U to the fiber above the domain of U. Okay. Which turns the fiber category into what is called an indexed category. I will give you an example now, it will be clearer. So the basic idea underlying the concept of indexed category is that you have a base category. Above each object of the base category, you have a fiber, and you have functors between the fibers corresponding to the morphisms in the base category. And the fact that you can translate a fiber category into an indexed category and vice versa is called Grothendieck's construction. So it has to do really with Grothendieck. So I will give you an example of fiber category or index category. I will use the terms synonymously. Consider the category of all continuous functions whatsoever. That's the category F, the big category F. And consider the base category of all topological spaces. And now the functor which assigns to any function its domain is a functor from the category of all functions to the category of all topological spaces, and it's a fiber category. So now, if you look at things as an index category, for each topological space X, you have a fiber which is comprised of all the functions having X as a domain. The fiber above X is made of all the functions with X as domain, as their domain. And you can see that each morphism U in the base category will induce a functor from the fiber above X to the fiber above X prime, but just by composition. So that's an example, and the general picture of an index category is the same. And the important thing is that the objects in the fiber above X are conceived of as local data about X. That's the. So you can now apply that framework to context dependence, and that requires introducing a fiber category about context dependence. And so let's introduce the category of all contexts of urgence. Okay, each context morphism being a comparison from the compared context to some prior context of reference. So examples of context morphism, the compared context X prime can be obtained from the context of reference by permutation or by specification. Okay. If the speaker and the listener swap their positions, that change the context, and that's a typical context shift. But another context morphism has to do with the fact that certain contexts are more specific than others. And you can consider a generic context, which is an ideal context, added to the category of all contexts, and which is supposed to be the least specific possible. So now that's for the base category. Now to get a fiber category, you have to introduce an upper category, the category of all semantic contents, and the fiber of above each context is made of all the semantic contents of expression uttered in that context. And given that's the main point, given a context shift, that context shift induces transposition of each semantic content above the codomain to a semantic content above the domain of that context shift. So examples, I will get back to the same example of the word red. Okay. So if I consider the dominant color of an object, which is not necessarily the color of the whole surface of that object, that's a context X2. And it's a specific way, it's a specification of another context X1, which is simply the context where you consider the color of an object. And that specification defines a context shift U from X2 to X1. And along that context shift, any semantic content, the semantic content of red in the sentence, the bird is red, this bird is red, can be understood as obtained by transposition from the semantic content that the word red has in the more generic context, X1. In the same way, if I say the pen is red, this pen is red, that happens in a certain context X3, and in that context, red has a new semantic content, E2, E3, and that semantic content E3 can be understood as obtained by transposition from the semantic content that red has in the content X2, where the sentence, this bird is red, is uttered. And the semantic content of red in X3 is obtained by transposition insofar as the context X3 is derelativized, so to speak, from the context X2. The semantic content E3 of the word red is obtained by transposition by being derelativized from the context X2 and from the semantic content that the word red had in context X2. So the idea is that any context shift indicates which adjustment you have to make to redefine, redetermine the semantic content that a certain word, a certain sentence has. And so it's a functorial scheme as opposed to the functional scheme I've mentioned about indexicalism. And the main idea behind that change is that the semantic content of an utterance is not determined context by context, but from context to context. Okay, so I've introduced a category of context, a category of semantic contents, and the natural functor going from the category of semantic contents to the category of context constitutes a fiber category. Okay. And in that framework, for instance, a proper name is but a constant section of the fiber category D I just introduced. So the fiber category D is the category of semantic contents over context of utterance. And a proper name is but a constant section of that fiber category. And an indexical is but a Cartesian section of fiber category. So I think that if you're interested in context dependence as context shift dependence, the framework of a fiber category obtrudes itself. It's very natural to consider. But there is another reason to consider a fiber category. It's that it makes possible to represent the amalgamation process that I'm interested in to account for linguistic meaning. And actually, Grothendieck introduced fiber categories to support his descent theory, which is the mathematical theory of amalgamation processes. Just a quick example. Imagine you have a topological space and a covering of that space, and above each component of the covering, you have a function. And you suppose that all the functions agree when they overlap, when their respective domains overlap. Then it's clear that there is a global function of which any local function is a restriction. You will glue together all those functions to get a global function above the whole topological space X. And that situation is encoded as follows in the framework of the fiber category. The family of local functions is an object above the disjunct sum of all the components of the covering, and so on. Sorry, I think I have to be quick, but you can have a quick look at the way the typical example I explained fits into the framework of a fiber category. You will consider just the base category of all topological spaces, the big category of all functions, and the typical example of gluing local functions together is easily describable in that fiber category. So that's the typical picture. Okay, you have a family F prime of functions, of local functions, which match up when their respective domains overlap. And the question is there a global function corresponding to that family of functions, to that family of local functions? And the answer is yes, in our example. But the answer is not always yes. And descent theory is about deciding whether the answer is yes or no. Okay, so that's the general purpose of descent. Given local data which match up when they overlap, is there a global object of which each local datum is a restriction? That's the purpose of that's the central question of descent theory. Okay, so a family of compatible local data is called a descent datum, and I've mentioned the exact definition, but it's not important here. A descent datum encodes simply a family of virtually gluable local data. Virtually gluable because they are compatible, because they match up when they overlap. And the question is, the big question of this theory is a virtual gluing actualizable as a single global object? If this is the case, the morphism U, going from the covering to the topological space, is said to be a descent morphism. So let's get back now to context dependence. The condition that defines a descent datum as an intuitive counterpart in connection with context dependence, because if you consider two semantic contents that an expression has in two different contexts, you can look at the overlapping of the two contexts. It's the most generic common specification of both contexts. And the matching of the respective transpositions of the two semantic contents of the same question means that the two semantic contents can be seen as compatible over that most generic common specification. So I will give just an example. It's not the same thing for a bird and for a pen to count as web. We'll continue with our example. Okay. But shifting to a more specific context may capture the compatibility of the two uses of the word red. So imagine a first context of utterance where you say that this red bird is a hummingbird. And let's consider another context, X2, where you say your red pen is on the table. Two contexts of use of the word red. Now, what could be the minimal context crossing the two contexts, X1 and X2? It's a context among the silent objects of which there is, say, a paintbrush dipped into red paint. The paintbrush is partially red as the red bird, but can also be used for red strokes as the red pen. And the paintbrush, the context having a paintbrush within as its salient object, among its salient objects, is an arbitrary witness of the fact that the two contextual uses of the word red agree when they overlap. You can make sense of the gluing condition that context dependent, that descent theory brings forward. If you pursue that framework of descent theory, the linguistic meaning of an expression can appear as the result of an amalgamation process in a literal sense, not in a metaphorical one. And descent theory helps us to make sense of that amalgamation process as a literal amalgamation and not a metaphorical one. So the linguistic meaning of an expression is the result of the amalgamation of a family of semantic contents which match up consistently. So the relatively general meaning of red, of the word red, is not obtained by abstraction in that view, but by an amalgamation generated by the projection along specific context shift of several particular contents attached to different specific contexts. What I would like to add is that once some general meaning of the word red has emerged as an amalgamation, it lends itself to being transposed into various contextual specifications, and then meaning appears to be some kind of germ a semantic content, a generic semantic content that you can transpose in more specific contexts. And we have here the two aspects of meaning that we're interested in. So the contents which contributed to the amalgamation of some meaning can be understood in retrospect as various aspectualizations of that meaning. And I think this captures quite well what we have called the dynamics of meaning. The fact that meaning is cannot be cannot include by anticipation all its semantic contents, but despite the fact that those semantic contents, when they are produced, appear as part of that meaning. I think that if we are more interested in philosophy of mathematics now, I think that that idea of the production of a global item by an amalgamation process has consequences about the nature of identity and the sense of what is an identification. In fact, I think we can get a new picture of what makes the identity of a general item, be it a virtual global function or the meaning of an utterance. So we have two different kinds of identification. Abstraction is one way to go. It corresponds to to identification in the sense of considering equivalence classes. Then two different items are identified despite their being different because they belong to the same equivalence class. That's the classical scheme of abstraction in a mathematical setting. But amalgamation, I think, corresponds to a distinct identification procedure where a global identity is introduced on the basis of different pieces being glued together, which are then reconsidered afterward as being so many different local aspects of the same entity. So whereas abstraction is the identification of different entities by cross-notation, amalgamation is the differentiation of local aspects of the same expectable global entity. And so identification by abstraction and identification by amalgamation ought to be clearly distinguished. In particular, isomorphisms do not play the same role. In the case of abstraction, an isomorphism indicates an identity of structure, whereas in the case of amalgamation, an isomorphism witnesses the occurrence of local data. And accordingly, I think two different concepts of structure are at play here. In the case of abstraction, structure is structure in the sense of mathematical structuralism. It's a pattern, a common pattern. But in the second case, in the framework of dysentery of identification by amalgamation, structure corresponds to the constraints set upon the gluing of local data, i.e. upon the construction of global sections of a fiber category. And two concepts of structure are evidently different. So I will have to be quick, I think. We could pursue the framework of dysentery by introducing the concept of stack. And that requires endowing the base category with a Grothendieck topology. A stack basically is a fiber category where the base category is endowed with a Grothendieck topology, and where each covering of the Grothendieck topology is a descent morphism. So, quick definition of what a stack is. So a stack is a fiber category where the base category is endowed with a Grothendieck topology, and where each virtual descent morphism is an actual descent morphism. I think that Grothendieck topologies have a very general application, a very natural application to context dependence. Think of the way language is taught and learned. The meaning of a word or of a sentence is often conveyed by a teacher to a child as the content jointly captured by paradigmatic, partially overlapping uses of it. So if you want to explain to a child what red is, you will take examples, and the examples are define a family of semantic contents, of paradigmatic semantic contents, and the meaning of red is suggested as being the result of the amalgamation of those paradigmatic semantic contents. And of course, different teacher, different sample of examples, but the result is the same. And it's exactly what a Grothendieck topology helps to capture. You can cover a global item using different coverings, but that will amount to the same in the end. Exactly like in language. Two people will explain the same word differently, resulting to different paradigmatic examples, different paradigmatic semantic contents, but the results of the amalgamation will be the same. And the general meaning aimed at by two people will be the same. So I think Grothendieck topologies have very natural application to language and to meaning. And in fact, a very natural Grothendieck topology can be defined on the base category of the fiber category corresponding to context dependence. So for lack of time, I think I have to skip that. But given that Grothendieck topology, I think that a natural conjecture is that, sorry, it's not seeds, it's the context the fiber category corresponding to context dependence, which I have called D, is a stack with respect to the natural Grothendieck topology that can be defined on the base category of that fiber category. So that conjecture that the fiber category corresponding to context dependence is a stack simply amounts to the fact that natural language works, that we manipulate semantic contents in different contexts, and that we are able to amalgamate them in a consistent way, which does not depend on the specific speaker. We agree each other to achieve the same amalgamations, or even though we carry out different amalgamations, they agree, they get the same result. So the fact that the fiber category D is a stack is just a way of capturing the fact that despite context dependence and despite the diversity of speakers, everything works out well in the sense that all the virtual amalgamations can be achieved and actualized as we expect them to be. Okay, so last thing, recall Marco's quote about the multitude of partial points of view mentioned by Grothendieck. I think that theme is echoed by Carlos Simpson in a text in the paper entitled Descent, which has been written about Grothendieck. And Carlos Simpson writes, the gluing data abstracted into the categorical structure of the topos of sieves provide the links which form a virtual reality from which the geometric object emerges. So the geometric object is the global object that is the target of the mathematician, and the virtual reality is the distant data, the family of local data that are virtually gluable. And Simpson had the original ground level fades from view, replaced by the abstract collection of gluing data itself as the only true reality, and so on. I think that this is as clear a description of meaning as one could hope to have. You could read Simpson's paper and think that it's a naive phenomenon, like reality does not exist, we only have points of view about reality. I think that it's not what Simpson means, and it's not what Grothendieck means. I think that the description that is given by Simpson does not fit reality, but fits very well meaning. Meaning is exactly what we get through the abstract collection of gluing data. To sum up, my proposal that context depends has associated two different points, which are the analogs of two important points of the framework of descent theory, namely reindexing and gluing. So contextual context of influences transpose along context shifts, that is something that corresponds to reindexing in descent theory. Linguistic meaning is obtained by amalgamation of a family of paradigmatic semantic contents, and that is an idea which corresponds to gluing in descent theory. So if we sum up that correspondence, the idea amounts to thinking of contextualization, of context dependence, and of the way language works as a kind of localization. Okay. Of course, the 2 points I've just mentioned suggest that language relies on two primitive abilities: the ability to transpose to a new context a given semantic content, and the ability to assess the amalgamability of matching semantic contents. And those two primitive abilities that are required from any speaker equal quite exactly what cognitive linguists have put forward about conceptual integration. So for lack of time, I will skip that, but there are I think, deep connections between the framework of descent theory as applied to context dependence and cognitive linguistics, in particular blending theory. And the prospect would be some kind of reconciliation between cognitive linguistics and formal semantics through the common use of descent theory. Thank you.